Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Scott Roberts with Scott Roberts Law. Today we'll be talking about marijuana microbusinesses. We're going to first go over licensing, and then from licensing we'll go to business operations, and then from there, there'll be time for questions. So before I begin, like I said, I'm Scott Roberts. I'm a corporate cannabis attorney here in Detroit. I've been practicing for 11 years, 4 years in cannabis. We work with the only two licensed micro businesses at the moment. And we are hoping that with the city of Detroit, hopefully opting in and having a ordinance that is ready to accept applications sometime soon, that we'll be able to have a lot of micro businesses here in Detroit. So with that, we're going to start with licensing. This is probably why most of you are here listening to me, is to kind of understand the licensing process. And I find it's easiest to break it down into 3 steps. The pre-qualification step, the municipal approval step, and what's sometimes referred to as the state step 2 or the facility qualification step. So for the pre-qualification step, there is a 90-day turnaround, maximum 90-day turnaround. When you submit that to the state of Michigan, there is a $6,000 fee, though there is a social equity discount for that. And what that is essentially kind of a background review. You will have to provide, your criminal background if you have any litigation you had been involved in if you have, any, state or other governmental licenses, if you have any of those, as well as, some additional tax information. And what happens is the state of Michigan reviews it. A lot of times they will have follow-up questions or deficiency notices that will be sent to you. When you do get a deficiency notice, you do have 5 business days to respond to it, but you can get an extension to that as long as you ask nicely. And then once they are through kind of reviewing everything and they're through with the background check, because they will run a background check on you. It takes about 30 business days for them to do that. Then hopefully you get pre-qualified. Usually this actually takes about 60 days, but there is language in the statute saying it can't take more than 90 days. So that's kind of the cap. But generally, we find that these take about 60 days. Sometimes they take less. Sometimes they maybe only take 45 days. Sometimes they take more. A lot of that depends on how many people are a part of the company and how many people have to go through that background check. You can count on this taking around 60 days. Once you get your pre-qualification, or kind of simultaneous with you going through that process, you'll need to get what's called, municipal approval or a municipal license. In cities such as Detroit, this is actually a 2-step process, as Detroit requires a special land use approval prior to applying for a business license. In Detroit, the special land use approval process is oftentimes pretty lengthy. It can take 6, 8, 9 months to go through. But once you go through that and you have a special land use approval on that property, you can go through the business licensing process. And the business licensing process is, a good amount quicker, maybe 1 to 2 months. And once you get that municipal approval and you have your pre-qualification, at that point, you kind of have enough certainty that you will be able to move forward with your project. Of course, to get a municipal approval, you do have to have a property. Municipalities won't give you the final approval, maybe provisional approval, but not the final approval without a property in place. But once you get that municipal license, you can start or feel confident in building out your facility, knowing that you'll be able to do, what you want to do, which hopefully in this case is a micro business in the city of Detroit. We can maybe touch on the cannabis lounges later if someone has questions on that, but right now we'll just focus on the micro businesses. So once you get those 2 steps done and you're nearing the end of your build out, the state generally asks not to submit more than 60 days before being ready for inspection. Then you submit what's called the step 2 or the facility qualification step. In this step, you're going to submit a bunch of plans. a staffing plan, a record keeping plan, security plan, and several more. I do say, you know, one thing that a lot of times people kind of overthink is the kind of level of detail in these plans. We've seen, you know, people prepare these plans at, you know, a staffing plan at 10, 15, 20 pages. That's unnecessary, and we suggest you don't do that. You know, a lot of times you're just putting in things that you will then be committed to do when you don't necessarily have to commit to do those things. So we generally recommend you keep them as short and simple as possible, and you don't make any extra commitments that you don't have to. As an example, our staffing plan, I believe, is about 1 paragraph. And, you know, I would say, you know, if you're going to do these yourself, you know, they will, if they think your plan is deficient for any reason, they will tell you, you know, what you need to do to fix it. So I generally recommend keeping those as short and sweet as possible. And as an additional note, you know, there is something saying you have to do a business plan. Same thing, you know, it could be 2 paragraphs, just, you know, here are the owners, this is what we're trying to do, this is where we're located. You do not have to, you know, put together detailed financials for this step. You may want to do that otherwise, but that's not something that's actually required. So when you're submitting these plans, just remember to keep it simple. It's not as complicated or as daunting as you may think. You can get away with 1 paragraph each for most of these plans. So don't create additional commitments for yourself by putting together these lengthy plans when you don't have to. Once you get those plans approved, you're going to have to go through inspections. And also note that, you know, those plans, you also have to submit a C of O and some insurance attestations and, you know, some other odds and ends. But once you pass that step, then the next step is inspections. Generally, BFS, the Bureau of Fire Services, goes first. There are 2 inspections you have to pass, one for BFS and one from MRA, which is the Marijuana Regulatory Agency. But usually the BFS inspection comes first, and that is to inspect for fire code. One thing that people generally screw up in this step is that when they have, you know, an architect do their plans, the architect doesn't know that they have to incorporate national or international fire code and not state fire code. National fire code is a little more strict. So we've seen a lot of instances where an architect will draw it to state fire code, not realizing he or she has to comply with national fire code, and that can cause issues. So when you're designing your facility, just make sure your architect knows he's not or she's not doing state fire code, but national fire code. You can save yourself a lot of money. We've had clients who've lost tens of thousands of dollars in weeks, if not months of time in opening due to that specific issue. So once BFS goes through your facility and find that it's up to fire code standards, the next one is MRA, or Marijuana Regulatory Agency. And I would note that their inspection checklists are available online, so you can actually print them out and go through them yourself. As a microbusiness, you know, you have to basically go through each part of that facility for that license type. So a microbusiness, and we'll get into this later, is, you know, in a way, it's a retailer license, it's a grower license, and a processor license all rolled into one. So when you're inspecting, say, the retail component of it, you want to use that retail checklist. Most of what MRA is looking for on this step is security based. They want to make sure you have all the security systems in place, so the full security camera coverage, all that sort of thing. There's a few other things like waste disposal that are not security related, but most of this step really just relates to security. And then once you pass that step, the final step in the process is to pay your licensing fee. And then once that is paid, and how much of that amount will depend on whether you're social equity or not. But once that is paid, then you will receive your license. You can order your metric tags and you're ready to operate. In this situation, municipalities do kind of control the process because the state will give a pre-qualification to pretty much anyone who is qualified, and will grant a step 2 to pretty much anyone that's pre-qualified, has the municipal approval. So the key here, and the hardest step in this process, is getting a property and getting it municipally pre-qualified or municipally approved or licensed. So kind of the microbusiness license basis, as I said, it's an all-inclusive license. You can almost think of it as like mini vertical integration. The microbusiness license allows you to grow, allows you to process, package, and then sell direct to the consumer. While it allows you to do all of that, you are limited to that in that you cannot currently bring in outside product from another facility, nor can you sell to another facility. You can only sell to consumers what you produce in-house as far as marijuana products. You can still sell other ancillary products. You know, I know hemp products are very popular to include in some of these stores, as well as, you know, papers, glassware, kind of ancillary smoking products. But with respect to marijuana, you can only, you know, sell what you grow or process yourself. And along those lines, each part of your facility is subject to the rules applicable to the license type. So there's really not as much in the rules, the MRA rules on micro businesses, other than to say, well, if it's a grow, you know, the grow part of it has to comply with all the grow rules, the processing rules, and the retailer rules. What this means is that, you know, as a micro business, you do have essentially a retailer license in a way. And that would mean you can also do things that a retailer can do, like deliver. And that's something I think a lot of people are starting to really explore and hone in on. Another thing about the microbusiness license, that unlike all the medical licenses, there are no capitalization requirements. You don't have to show a certain amount of money in order to apply. The MRA simply does not care. You will need a certain amount of money in order to build out your facility, pay your architect, pay the licensing fees, maybe get some, you know, initial equipment and non-marijuana inventory into the store, but that's not something you have to worry about from a licensing perspective. There are a lot of limits. You know, if you own one micro business, you can't own another license type, with the exception being an event license and a designated consumption area or consumption lounge license. You know, there was a limitation about, you know, having to be a Michigan resident. If there's anyone on this Zoom call that isn't, you can just form a Michigan LLC and that will still count. But, you know, there are some other limitations. I will say the biggest issue our currently operating micro businesses are facing is testing costs. They're, you know, because they're smaller, they have smaller batch sizes, meaning they pay higher amounts per test per amount of product. So that is a cost that micro businesses kind of have to deal with a little more than other facilities. And the number two is product selection. Because you can only sell what you produce, you're not going to be able to produce every single product that your typical dispensary can produce. You know, chances are you're not going to be able to make some of those topical products. You may not even want to. You may want to focus on, you know, one or two products or types of products and do those very well and have more of kind of a niche within the marijuana industry instead of trying to do everything. Because it can be very difficult if you try to do everything to have all those products and produce them cost effectively. So we touched on some of these, but I guess my biggest piece of advice to everyone on this call that is looking to do a micro business is try not to compete directly with dispensaries. And what I mean by that is try to do things a little differently. If you're just trying to be a dispensary, you know, chances are the dispensaries are going to be able to do it better because they're going to have a lot more money. They're going to have access to any number of products, and many of them are already vertical as well. And they're just going to be able to do and provide services or goods that you're not going to be able to do. You know, if you go to a dispensary, they might have 15 different brands of edibles. you're not going to be able to do that. So my suggestion is to kind of hone in on what you can do and what you can do very well and try to focus on that, because competing directly with a dispensary is going to be very difficult, especially in Detroit, where there's going to be, about 75 recreational dispensaries, which is a good amount. So, try to be a little different and find a niche within the cannabis industry. I think that's the best way to be set up for success. A lot of people compare microbusinesses to craft breweries. And in a way, that's correct. There are some similarities, but in a way, it's not. And one of the biggest misconceptions is that the microbusinesses themselves allow consumption on site. And that's not the case. You can't, by virtue of just owning a microbusiness license, have an area where people test out the product like they would at a microbrewery. You can have consumption, but that requires a separate license. It does have to be a separate facility, but it can really be in the same building, and just call it, Suite A is the microbusiness and Suite B is a designated consumption area. But the microbusiness itself does not grant you the right to have consumption on premises. And one of the biggest issues that happen is that municipal zoning and real estate acquisition. That's by far usually the toughest part in the process for every single potential licensees. And, with Detroit, I do know there are some land bank properties that may be made available. And if you're lucky enough to get one of those, that's great. But if not, you're going to have to understand that for the most part, the prices are going to be somewhat inflated compared to the market price by virtue of the fact it's zoned for cannabis. Whether it's Detroit, whether it's Royal Oak, whether it's Flint, Lansing, or any other city, if a property is zoned for cannabis and eligible for a license, there's almost always a premium to purchase that property. So because of that, you may be in a position where you're going to have to pay a little more than you originally thought to get the property that you want. Another big hurdle is that, because you're fully integrated, but you can't take in product from other sources, a bottleneck, say on the growth side of your operation, is then going to kind of go down that chain. So if you have, flour that fails testing, then you're not going to have as much flour for the retail side of your business. Additionally, you might not have that trim to make the products you wanted under processing. So, a bottleneck in one part of your operation kind of flows down into your entire operation. So because of that, it's very important you get everything, all three aspects of it right, because if you screw one up, that can affect the other three, and that can affect the viability of your business long term. Along those lines, you do have to kind of be an expert or have an expert on everything. You don't have to do processing. So it may be that you just want to produce high-end flour or exotic flour, or just kind of stick to the flour market and not bother with processing, because that can be, expensive and time consuming, and just sell flour out of your retail establishment. Having said that, you'll still need a really good grower if you're going to be successful. So you're going to need an expert in growing, and you're going to need an expert or someone who knows retail, because those are both very important aspects of your business. And if you're going to be doing processing, you're going to need someone who knows processing as well. And it very well may be that you yourself don't have all three of those expertise, which is okay, as long as you find someone that can kind of complement your skill set. There has been talk of changes, some of them on the legislative level. Some of them have been suggested to MRA. There is a current lobbying effort to change the microbusiness license to make it more competitive. The biggest potential change would be increasing the plant count from 150 plants to 300 plants. This would require legislative action, and that might be hard to do. And there was a minor scandal that did kind of pause some of the lobbying on this. It wasn't really that big of a deal, but people kind of blew it out of proportion in my mind. And, I'm also, finalizing a draft letter to MRA to suggest some changes that are not required with legislative action. By changing the definition of a plant, you could increase your output very substantially. If anyone is interested in helping out on this kind of informal lobbying effort, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email will be available at the end of this presentation. With that, we'll kind of go into some potential business models, because I think a lot of people, when they think the microbusiness, they're thinking, I'm just going to do a dispensary. And I think there's a lot more to this license type than just being a dispensary. And I also think just trying to be a dispensary is not necessarily the way to go, because as I said before, that means you're going to have to compete directly with the dispensaries. And the dispensaries, they have a very big budget. They have a lot of expertise. They have a lot of money. So it's going to be hard to compete with them directly. But, there are a lot of other things that you can do to be a little different, to be a little unique, and stand apart such that, you can do well and be successful in this industry with this license type. I would encourage you to check out California. They do have a micro business license there. It's a little different than here in Michigan, but not terribly different. And it's, it's a couple years ahead of us. So you can actually search out and Google around and see how some micro businesses in California are doing and the business models they've used and how that has gone, as just kind of a way to do a little more market research. Because that's something I would very much encourage you guys, everyone on this call, to do, is not just to jump head into this. You're really going to want to do research. And that means trying to, budget the project, see how much it's going to take, and then probably add another 20-30% minimum on that, because these projects in the cannabis industry tend not to ever come in on budget or on time. So you're going to need to make sure you have additional money than what you budgeted, because chances are you're going to need it, because there are issues that can come up, especially in construction. And you think something's going to be 100, and then it turns out it's 130 grand. And if you don't have some flexibility or kind of extra money budgeted for those overruns, you may be in a situation where you spend all your money and you're only, say, 80% finished, and then you don't have enough money to finish everything, and then you end up with essentially nothing. And obviously that's something you want to avoid. So, make sure you want to budget out your numbers. You want to put together what's called a pro forma. What that means is just kind of a 1-year profit loss statement. So you try to estimate all the money you're going to be bringing in through flower sales or product sales or non-marijuana product sales. You also want to estimate all your costs in terms of employees, electricity, insurance, etc. And, run the numbers and make sure that this business, as you are planning it, is profitable. Because obviously you don't want to start running an unprofitable business. And thirdly, just do some market research. I do think that there's a lot of room for creativity when coming up with business models for micro businesses. And even if it's very creative, there's a good chance someone had already thought about it first and is doing what you want to do somewhere else. So I'd encourage you to kind of, snoop around Google, find out how those sort of models have gone for other companies or other groups, and, really try to flesh it out. So, that is all to say, I think with the cannabis industry, a lot of times people come into it thinking they're just going to make money and it's easy money, and it's not easy money. I want to be clear. It is not easy money. A lot of these dispensaries in Detroit don't even make money, and they're totally fine not making money, because they're making money on their grow facility, or they can just continually raise money. And for them, they just want market share. because they're going to sell to someone else later, so they don't even care if they're profitable. For you guys, obviously, that it's going to be different. You're going to need to be profitable. So really, really do your research, because this isn't as easy as an industry as many think. There are a lot of people that kind of get eaten up and chewed out here in this industry. I've seen it a lot. So really make sure you've done all your research so you know what you're getting yourself into. So, one thing about Detroit that I was very happy to see is that they are allowing a fair amount of the designated consumption area or cannabis lounges. I think this is probably the most natural, tried and true niche business model for the microbusiness that you can do. Anyone who's heard of these kind of Amsterdam coffee shops, that's essentially what this is. It allows you to sell, and then right next door you have a consumption lounge where people can take the product that they bought and enjoy it. And I think that's something that can really help drive business and set you apart from a lot of the other dispensaries, and can also be a destination that people go to. You may have trouble with people trying to come in who haven't bought from your store. I know a lot of the companies that I'm working with, what they're doing is having kind of door fees or entrance fees, unless you can show a receipt saying you bought product from the store, and then you get in for free. That kind of solves that problem. And you can't have food. It's a little tricky because you do have to work with the Wayne County Health Department, and it's not super easy to do that, to have food in an area with smoking. You can just ask any owner of a hookah lounge. But I think that's something, because not a lot of cities have authorized the consumption lounges, but Detroit has, and has authorized a fair amount of them. I think that's something that could do very well, and something, a kind of a business model or a niche that has been tried and true and tested, and could do very well here in the city of Detroit. Another, the boutique dispensary. This tends to be what people go with, but it's probably very difficult, if not one of the most difficult ones to pull off, because again, you're competing with dispensaries that are going to have more and better products than you, different product varieties that you're just not going to be able to compete with. So if you do go this, I do encourage you to try to do a few things well, or amazingly well, then try to do everything okay. You could do a boutique edible shop. This is a little tricky again, because all products have to be shelf stable if sold. The way people tend to get around this is by, say, selling the icing or sprinkles that they can then sell in conjunction with the bakery. So someone can buy a cake, and then they can buy the icing, and the icing is infused. And that's just kind of a way to get around that restriction. And just generally, I think, the microbusiness can be paired with a lot of other types of businesses in a way that can, both drive business to your microbusiness as well as drive business to this other business. Whether it's an arcade, a, bed and breakfast, a spa. There are a lot of different businesses where, by adding that microbusiness component, I think, you could, create a situation where it's kind of synergistic and it helps both businesses. Additionally, there's kind of a farmers co-op model that I've been personally tinkering around with for the last couple of years. This would be if we were able to get, city of Detroit to, say, a part of Eastern Market or somewhere else as event space, and then have a event there every Saturday or Sunday. I'd say Saturday to get the Eastern Market crowd. Then those micro businesses could be the vendors at that event, and you could have a little Detroit micro business farmers market. I think that's something that would attract a lot of people. It would be something you'd have to cooperate with other micro businesses on. You probably all don't want to try to do the same product. So maybe one, couple focus on flour, maybe a couple focus on processed products, et cetera. But I think that's something that does have a lot of potential here in Detroit, especially with Eastern Market and the crowds Eastern Market draws. So that's just something to consider as well. As far as just general business strategies, because you are limited to 150 plants currently, it is going to be important that you get the highest yield per plant that you can. I know a lot of good growers can get 2, 3, possibly more pounds per light. You may want to do 1 plant per light as a way to just maximize the output of your facility, because if you're going to do processing products, that requires a lot of product, and this generally you're going to want to have as much product to sell as you can. So maximizing the yield per plant will be very important to your business strategy going forward, and allow you to get the most revenue and be as profitable as possible. As I had said before, you want to try to have a unique value proposition or something that's a little different than the typical dispensary, because you got to give people a reason to go to you and not, say, House of Dank or somewhere else. So you got to have that unique value proposition or niche that you can really own. You're probably going to have to do lower quantity sales and also rely on ancillary product income. A lot of these stores do have hemp products, and that's something where you can, there's no limitations on, the amount of hemp products you can sell or other products you can sell. So you're probably going to want to try to really make sure you maximize that. And that's not only because you certainly want additional revenue streams, that's always good for a business, but it's also because of 280E. And 280E is something I'm going to touch on real quick, because it's going to really affect your business and affects every single licensed cannabis business here in the US in one way, shape, or form. Granted, if and when the United States ever decriminalizes or legalizes marijuana, this tax provision will go away. But for now, we have to deal with it, and you should really know about it, because it's very important, and it's really going to affect the profitability of your business. What 280E is, in a nutshell, it says that any company or person that deals in a controlled substance, which marijuana is, they can't take any business tax deductions other than costs of goods sold, which isn't technically a deduction, but kind of is. So what that means, if you're a dispensary, let's just say you're Sedank or someone like that, if you're a dispensary, you can deduct the cost of your wholesale product purchases and any packaging and inventory and storage costs, but you can't deduct any other costs for your business. So let's just say you make $2 million in revenue and you have $100 million in product costs. So you have $1 million in gross profit, or net. And then you have, say, $500,000 in employee costs, $300,000 in mortgages, and all that other stuff. You might think, all right, well, I have $2 million in revenue, I have $1.8 million in costs, I made $200,000. Unfortunately, that's not the case. You actually probably lost money. And let me tell you why. So with 280E, because you can only deduct those product costs, you're actually taxed as if you made $1 million, even though you didn't. So if you were to apply kind of the general corporate tax, or a higher marginal income tax, then you're looking at, say, $300,000. So if you have a $300,000 tax bill, instead of making $200,000, you've actually lost $100,000, which seems crazy, but it actually happens in this business all the time, where people make money on paper, but after they pay their tax bill, they realize they actually lost money. And sometimes they lost a substantial amount of money. So this is very important to know. 280E affects each part of your business differently. I just went through the retail. On the growth side, it's a bit more favorable because a lot more things are considered cost of goods sold. So for instance, your cultivation space, any rent or mortgage attributable to that is considered a cost of goods because you need it to produce the goods. Your cultivation employees similarly are costs of goods because you need those employees to produce the flower. So that goes into the cost of that good. Utilities, which is always the biggest thing as a grower, that's also, the utilities that are used to power the lights and the HVAC, that's also considered a cost of good because obviously you need those lights and HVAC to produce the marijuana. So on the growth side, and similarly, somewhat on the processing, you're not as badly affected, but on the retail side of your business, that's where 280E really comes into play and can really hurt you. We have some strategies for dealing with that. You may only have one, designated retail employee, and then you may take one of your cultivation employees, for example, and every time there's a couple, there's a line starting to form, you pull in that cultivation employee and they become a retail employee for an hour or a half hour, whatever the case may be. So if you're doing that, then at least let's just say that person works an 8-hour day and 2 hours are spent on retail and 6 are on cultivation. Then at least 3/4 of their salary is actually tax deductible. Additionally, a lot of times when companies are designing these facilities, they're not going to allocate as much space as they otherwise would to the retail element because they know that that space isn't actually tax deductible. So with that said, 280E is something that you really, really need to think about because that's really going to affect, at least for the profitability of your business. As far as kind of additional keys for success, we've gone over a lot of these, but I guess the other one I would say is, make sure that when you hire or you partner with people, you do your homework. If you're, say, someone with a strong retail experience and you want to start one of these, you're going to want to make sure you find a very strong grower. And with that, you want to make sure that they grow in a way that can pass the safety testing requirements issued by the state of Michigan. There are a lot of caregivers that are very good, and then there's a lot that maybe aren't quite as good. So you're going to want to vet them about, how much do you produce? What is the quality that you produce? But you're also going to want to make sure you see their testing results and not just, what's the THC, but you want to see the testing for the things that the state tests for, because they may be, able to produce great product, but because of how they grow, they may fail mold testing almost every single time. So you're going to want to make sure you vet the grower for not just the product, but also, can they pass testing? Because if they can't, and you bring that person on and then they grow a bunch of product and they fail testing, then you're going to be out of business pretty quickly. When looking at these people, you're also probably going to want to bring on a caregiver, because if you add a caregiver to your microbusiness license, it gives you a very big advantage. That advantage is that caregiver can make a one-time, as soon as you get licensed, transfer of all their caregiver plants, up to 72 plants, directly into the microbusiness. And that's kind of a big deal, because if you weren't doing that, you would get licensed, and then it would take you maybe about 4 months before you had your first product to sell. And 4 months is a long time to operate a business without having any revenue whatsoever. So if you bring a caregiver on and the timing is correct, and when we've done this with both our current microbusiness licensees, and the timing was fairly good for both, where they're bringing in fully mature flowering plants as part of their 72 plant one-time caregiver transfer. That means, they come in, the plants come in, and then, they may be cut down a day, 2 days, a week later, and then you have product right away instead of waiting 4 months to get product, which can take, that's a big deal because you're saving, 3 months, and you're having 3 months of additional revenue, if not more than 3 months. Also, I will say, there's a lot of business consultants in this space, as well as attorneys and accountants and the like, and they are not all created equal. Some talk a big game and can't deliver. Some are the opposite. They may be very humble, but are, those may be some of the best consultants or partners or growers in the space. So you don't want to, in this industry, ever just trust, a consultant or attorney, or just take them at their word without kind of doing a little homework. That may mean, looking them up online and looking at their reviews. Though, sometimes people can play around with that and have good reviews, even if they aren't well reviewed by their actual clients. But, you can ask around, you can ask them to provide a reference of an existing client. But I will say you really want to do your homework when you're considering a partner or hiring a business consultant, an attorney, or an accountant. Because there's, I can speak from experience, there's a lot of great attorneys in the space, and there's a lot of really crappy attorneys. And a lot of times it's the really crappy attorneys that are the ones really getting out there and shilling their services. So just make sure you do your homework before, bringing someone on as a partner or as a consultant or, an employee as well. And, with that said, I think it's about time we can open things up for questions. So as I said, I'm Scott Roberts with Scott Roberts Law. We're a Detroit cannabis business law firm. I also own and operate Michigan Cannabis Properties, which helps groups buy, sell, and lease cannabis properties throughout the state of Michigan. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Scott. A lot of really, really valuable information, I believe, that was included on this week's session. We do have some questions specifically in regards to that plant count. Can you just reiterate what the plant count currently is for a micro business?
So right now the plant count is 150 plants. And that's a great question because in this presentation, I never told you what counts as a plant, and I probably should have. So under the MRTMA, which is what the micro business license is under, a plant for this plant count purposes is anything that is 8 inches tall or wide. So you can have 150 plants that are at least 8 inches tall or wide. And one of the things that has been discussed as a potential change would be changing the definition of a plant to basically a flowering plant, which would mean plants in veg would not count. And if there are any growers here, they'll know what a big deal that actually is, because veg time is generally a significant portion of the growth cycle. So to answer the question, a plant is, you can have 150 plants, maybe it ups to 300, maybe not. That depends on the Michigan legislature. But there's also a chance that the definition of that plant could change in a way that you actually have more real plants, just the same amount of plants as far as what the MRA considers a plant for plant count purposes.
Got it. Okay. And this is a question in regards to financing and investors. Can one find investors for a micro licensed business if you have all the expertise?
Yeah, you can definitely find investors. We've had a lot of clients, be able to find their own investors. I'm not going to tell you it's easy, because most of the time it's not, but it's definitely possible. And we've had a lot of people be able to do it. As a matter of fact, I have a micro business group right now that's raising money, and they have potential investors that are looking to put money into the micro business concept. So to answer the question, 100%.
Got it. And also to that end, on June 28th at 4 o'clock on this same Facebook Live, we are actually going to, the theme of that and the topic is going to be financing and investors and creative ways of getting funding and things of that sort. So thank you so much for that, Scott. And we'll also be doing a full session just on that on June the 28th. One question that we got is an email. It says, I'm interested to hear what you have to say, because I also will have a response that I got on this a couple weeks ago. I want to open a restaurant serving cannabis-infused food and beverages. Do we have the same zoning restrictions as other licenses, i.e. drug-free zones, churches, liquor stores, etc.?
So in Detroit, this is all potentially subject to change, but I believe Detroit is taking the position that if something is okay for a grow facility or a processing facility, it's okay for a micro business. So in Detroit, with those restrictions, it does have to be away from a drug-free zone. The cultivation doesn't have to, doesn't have to apply to the other setbacks like a church or a youth activity center or the like, but you do have to still comply with the zoning restrictions on a municipality. And I will just very briefly touch on the restaurant thing, because that kind of brings me back to a point I touched on before, which is, if you're selling a cannabis product, it has to be shelf stable and it has to be tested. So you can't just sell, have a micro business restaurant and prepare marijuana infused foods. You can have a restaurant separately, have a micro business, and in that micro business maybe sell toppings to certain food items that are shelf stable, but you can't actually have, say, a micro business restaurant that is selling infused food items.
Right. And so that's one thing I was going to share. Our very first event, we did it with Andrew Brisboe, and it was specifically about cannabis events. And one of the things that we learned is that any events where you are infusing food is technically illegal. One other item that Andrew shared with us is he said, anytime you infuse any sort of food, you then cross into areas of FDA and USDA approval, which is federal and not state. And that's another reason why that is unable to happen. So that was actually something that I learned on that event. So whoever sent that note, hopefully that doesn't discourage you. And I think Scott may have provided a creative way, but you will have to modify, I believe, the business model because cannabis and food and beverages, in the words of Andrew Brisboe, are quote unquote, do not have a legal pathway, is what I was told. Next question is, what is your advice on the zoning around micro businesses in Detroit? The zoning available just speaks to cultivation, dispensaries, etc., not specifically micro licenses.
So I believe with micro licenses, the micro business licenses, the city is taking the position that if it's zoned for cultivation and processing, then it is zoned for micro businesses. So if you're looking or evaluating property, that is what you want to look for. Even better if that property already has a special land use, because as I had mentioned before, those take quite a long time in the city of Detroit. minimum 6 months, mostly more than that. So if you can find a property that has already gone through that SLU process, that's what you're going to want to do, because you're going to save yourself 6, 7, 8, 9 months in terms of going through the city's special land use process.
Okay, I just asked if there are any more questions. I haven't seen any come in. I don't know, Isaiah, if you've gotten any more. But while we do a last call for questions, again, Scott wanted to thank you for your time. I think our attendees have gotten some great information, both directly and indirectly about the business in the industry. So thank you again for agreeing to be on the Zoom with us. And I'm going to quickly share my screen and let you all just see the quick invite to next week's event. I hope that you all can see my screen. But next week, we are going to be learning about banking compliance. We will have Nicole Perry, who is the Vice President of Treasury Management. She's an officer at Dart Bank. And on that webinar, we'll be learning about cannabis rules and compliance as it regards banking, and then banking account options and what is available, because there are definitely restrictions as it relates to banking and compliance. So thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.